The only place you people belong is some filthy slum, not walking into a courthouse. Officer Brent Harlow shouted at the gates, then forced Amira Holt's head down with his hand, making her kneel like a beggar in front of a laughing crowd. 10 minutes later, he stood frozen like a statue as that same woman walked out, wearing a judge's robe, her voice cold as steel. Today, you just carved a headstone for your own career. Do you think the officer's actions deserve condemnation? Drop a comment below and stay tuned to the end to see what happens to someone who abuses their power. The sky over Jefferson was dim, as if covered in ash, cold wind sweeping along the stone columns of the federal courthouse where each footstep echoed like the space itself was listening. On the broad steps leading to the main gate, Amira Holt walked slowly, one hand clutching a dark leather file case, her eyes fixed on the tall wooden doors glowing with a pale light. Every step she took was so calm that the guards turned to look. In Jefferson, the calm of a black woman in the administrative district often stirred discomfort, and that morning the discomfort had a face: Officer Brent Harlow. He leaned against the railing, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a cup of coffee, his stance that of someone used to giving orders. When he saw Amira approaching, his gaze shifted from indifference to scrutiny. He checked his watch, then looked her over from head to toe, a smirk curling on his lips, half mocking, half challenging. "The courthouse isn't open to the public yet," he said, his voice rough and dry like an old blade. "Where do you think you're going?" The question wasn't meant to be answered, but to test whether she would yield. Amira stopped in front of him, posture straight head, slightly tilted, her voice low and clear. "I have business inside, nothing more." The silence made Harlow pause, then give a short laugh. Inside the courthouse, he repeated, stressing each word and throwing him and a scornful look at her composed eyes. "People get in here with power, not skin color." The wind picked up, scattering a few papers across the desk. The sound of paper brushing against stone was sharp as ice. A gate officer looked over, about to tell Harlow to stop, but one glance from him made the words die. Amira didn't move. Light reflected off her cheek, making her face stand out in the gray morning. Harlow took a sip of coffee, waiting for a reaction, a flash of anger, a retort, or at least a flicker of unease. But Amira only nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a weather report. "Did you hear me?" Harlow said, louder voice, lowering in tone. "This is the executive zone, not a place anyone walks in and out of." He stepped closer, his shoes striking the stone steps with a hard, heavy sound. "Do you have any documents proving you belong here? Or do you think that icy attitude will get you past me?" Amira opened her case, took out a sealed envelope, and said evenly, "I have an appointment letter, but I don't think you're the one meant to see it." The smile faded from Harlow's face. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice now threatening. "I know you're standing in the way of someone who has work to do." She answered, her expression unchanged. A few bystanders had stopped to watch. What seemed minor was stretching too long. Heat rose in Harlow's neck. Her silent defiance provoked him more than words ever could. "You think you're special. In this city, people like you don't get far." He took another step, leaning slightly so his shadow fell across her face. "I'm telling you to turn around before I turn this small matter into something serious." Amira looked him in the eye, steady, still, and indifferent. "If a scene is what you need to feel important, go ahead," she said, her voice low, but each word clear enough that even the wind couldn't drown it out. Her words silenced the onlookers. A young officer nearby took a small step back. Harlow gripped his coffee tighter, his glare shifting from anger to something between doubt and pride. "You speak well," he said, "but around here decisions aren't made by your mouth." He pointed toward the outer gate. "Step down. Go around to the civilian side. If you take one more step, I'll treat it as resisting orders." The air thickened. A distant car horn sounded like it came from another world. Amira kept her gaze fixed on the courthouse doors. She didn't answer. A drop of coffee fell from Harlow's hand, hitting the stone floor and bursting into a small brown brown stain, and in that moment he realized her silence carried more weight than any protest. Murmurs rose among passers-by, whispers passed from one to another. "What's going on?" Another random stop. A middle-aged woman muttered, "When will this courthouse ever change?" Harlow heard it, but didn't respond. He looked at Amira one last time and said quietly, "You should know your place before you get yourself in trouble." Amira replied softly, her eyes still on the door. "I know exactly where I stand, and soon so will you." The words rang out like an early bell, quiet but lasting in the minds of those who watched. As she stepped past the threshold, her shadow stretched across the stone, calm and steady, the exact opposite of the storm building inside the man who had just tried to prove his power. Jefferson entered a gray morning where a small confrontation was about to spark a storm that would shake the entire city. Police boots hit the stone steps with a dry rhythm, each strike sounding like a countdown to a show of authority. After the brief encounter, Brent Harlow had no intention of backing down. Amira's calm had made him feel diminished on the very ground he believed was his. From the security room, 2 more officers stepped out, one of them Dane Keller, known for joking in sensitive moments, phone already in hand. "What's going on, Brent?" he asked, half laughing, a lost civilian. Harlow glanced at Amira and replied loud enough for the entire courtyard to hear. "Someone who thinks confidence alone can get her through these doors." His words drew mocking laughter from those who had just arrived. A small note slipped off the guard's desk and rolled to Amira's feet. Harlow bent to pick it up, but instead of handing it back, he tossed it toward her. "If you're really here on business, kneel down and pick it up," he said, his voice sharp through clenched teeth. "Show me how obedient you are." The air thickened. A few civilians paused mid-process, their eyes turning toward the scene. Amira stood still, her shadow stretched across the stone face, calm to the point of cold. "You're wasting your time," she said quietly, "and this city's." Her words cut off the laughter completely. Harlow raised an eyebrow, then slowly turned to his colleagues, his tone tinged with challenge. "Gentlemen, take note. This is a lesson in manners for people who think they belong here." Keller lifted his phone, tilting for the best angle. "Let me send it to the media team," he said, a mocking grin on his face. "They could use some training footage." The dry click of recording echoed. The camera captured the woman standing tall, surrounded by 3 officers, the white columns behind her, and the light hitting her face so clearly that nothing was hidden. A few passers-by backed away, none daring to intervene. That morning felt less like a routine check and more like watching a public shaman ritual. Harlow stepped forward, voice low and triumphant. "I'll give you one last chance. Pick it up and leave. That's it." Amira looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the man in front of her. "What are you hoping to get from this? Respect or fear?" Harlow stopped smiling, his lips twitching slightly, but the sounds around them kept him from backing off. "You think you've earned the right to question me?" he shouted, pushing his voice louder. "I'm not asking about rights," she said calmly. "I'm asking what you use your power for. To prove justice is just a selective display." Keller laughed, his face lit by his phone screen. "God, that sounds like a lecture. Brent, she might be a philosophy professor." Harlow narrowed his eyes, anger now fully lit. "Shut up, Keller," he snapped, then turned back. "I said do it, now." The air was so still you could hear leaves fall from the oak tree beside the gate. Amira didn't move. Wind passed through her coat, carrying the metallic scent of the railing. Harlow raised his hand, voice sharper now. "This is an order. You're wasting the time of law enforcement." The words dropped heavy, spoken like someone who believed power meant putting others beneath him. "And you," she replied slowly, "are wasting what gives that power its worth." The calm in her voice made Keller pause mid-recording. Harlow stepped closer, hand gripping his belt, eyes burning. "Are you resisting me?" Amira met his gaze, her tone steady. "I'm standing where I have the right to stand. If that feels like a threat to you, Maybe the problem is you." The words slid like a blade into his pride. Around them, murmurs grew. More eyes turned toward Keller's phone, which had now captured nearly the whole exchange. Harlow turned, swallowing his anger, but the whispers cracked his composure. He raised his hand again, trying to smirk, but his voice shook. "Fine. If you want a challenge, I'll show you discipline." The line opened a door to a chain of mistakes he couldn't take back. When Amira stayed still, he turned to Keller. "Keep filming. Let them see how we handle someone who forgets their place." Keller nodded, raising the camera higher. Amira stood centered in the frame, eyes fixed on the courthouse behind her, where white stone statues of justice watched in silence. Harlow kept talking louder now, trying to drown out his own unease. "You think silence makes you right? Here only my voice counts." Amira tilted her head, gaze sharp. "You're wrong, Officer Harlow. Here the only voice that counts is the truth." Her words cracked the air. A young officer behind Harlow took a step back. Wind stirred the flag above the gate, a reminder of something everyone had forgotten. In that moment, Harlow noticed how some eyes were turning toward him, and for the first time her silence made him feel truly small. Still, he didn't back down. "Then stand there," he said, "and let's see who kneels first." He turned sharply, trying to hide the threat he hadn't yet named. That morning, Jefferson grew heavy as a single sentence lit the fuse for the justice reckoning ahead. Brent Harlow's shout echoed across the wide stone plaza, silencing nearby conversations. A soft breeze swept through, carrying the scent of car exhaust and cold air from the Jefferson River, freezing the atmosphere in place. Bystanders stopped. A few white women in business clothes paused by the railing, coffee cups in hand, their eyes lighting up with the familiar thrill of seeing a black person put in place. In what looked like a peaceful morning, the explosion came from power being flaunted raw and loud at the gates of a courthouse built to defend justice. Amira Holt stood tall, her gaze unnervingly calm, while Harlow had shed the nonchalance he had worn earlier. He strode towards her, voice thick with the anger her silence kept fueling. "I said, kneel," he yelled, his voice bouncing off the glass walls. "Don't make me prove my authority." To him, those words were a last weapon to regain control. But to the crowd watching, they sounded like a tear ripping through fragile faith in justice. An old man sitting on the steps, coat faded with age, shook his head. His voice was rough but clear. "This is a courthouse, not a training camp." A few younger onlookers looked down, a flicker of shame brushing their faces as if they too saw the line being crossed. Keller still held the phone, his eyes gleaming with unsettling excitement. He slowly panned the lens, capturing Amira's every move, every tense breath, every second he thought he was recording proof of order. Amira took a deep breath, eyes lifting toward the American flag above the gate, its fabric fluttering in the light. She knew every second was being recorded, not just by Keller's phone, but by dozens of watching eyes. Still, she didn't move. She knew even a small reaction could be twisted into guilt. Harlow stepped closer, black shoes hitting stone with a weight that felt like the beat of collapsing reason. "You think I'll back down?" he said, voice cracking under pressure. "Here I am, the law. If I say kneel, you kneel." Amira looked up, locking eyes with him, calm enough to shrink the rage in his chest. "You're proving something else," she replied slowly, every word steady. "That justice here has already died in your hands." Her voice, though soft, shattered the moment. No one breathed. Keller lowered the phone halfway, his gaze unsteady. A woman in the crowd covered her mouth. The old man on the steps tilted his head as if hearing something larger than the clash in front of them. Harlow stood frozen, his face tightening, a smirk tugging but failing. "You accusing me now?" he asked, voice hoarse and dull. "You have no idea what I can do with words like that." "What I do know," Amira said, her voice lowering, "is that you're turning yourself into proof of everything this courthouse was built to stand against." The words carried, hitting the glass walls and bouncing back as a dull echo that felt heavy to anyone listening. A young man recording on his phone slowly lowered it, uncertainty in his eyes. Harlow looked around. around and saw the attention had shifted. The crowd's gaze was no longer silent support, but scrutiny. Keller tried to break the tension with a joke, but his voice caught halfway. "Maybe we should let it go, Brent," he muttered, but Harlow wasn't listening. His anger and pride, shaped by a lifetime of giving orders, clouded his sense. "You think you're smarter?" he growled. "You'll learn your place soon enough." He moved closer, only a few steps between them now. People braced for contact, but Amira didn't step back. Silence spread. No one spoke. No one dared breathe deeply. The sound of falling leaves whined weaving through the columns, and a flag stirring above blended into something strange, still and full of pressure. Harlow stood there, sweat forming at his collar, eyes flickering between fury and confusion. In Amira's cold, clear stare, he suddenly saw himself small, distorted, and weak. A woman in the crowd whispered, barely audible, "She doesn't need to shout. He already lost." That single line triggered movement. Phones began to rise one by one, capturing the scene. Harlow realized he was surrounded not just by two fellow officers, but by the eyes of an entire city. And at the center of it all, Amira Holt stood firm. Her gaze locked on him like a mirror, reflecting back the image of justice he had twisted. Jefferson was no longer in a normal morning. It had become the start of a verdict yet to be spoken, where the one on trial hadn't realized the judge's bench was already waiting behind the courthouse door. He stepped close to Amira Holt, eyes tight with the need to prove he was the center of it all. The morning wind had shifted, pushing through the flags above as if trying to cover the scene unfolding below. Harlow reached out and grabbed her shoulder, emotion small in appearance but heavy with abusive power. The force tilted her slightly, and her knee hit the stone step with a dry crack that made the crowd flinch. Recording sounds echoed as dozens of phones were raised, capturing a black woman kneeling at the gates of a federal courthouse. Time seemed to stretch. Amira said nothing, lips pressed tight, eyes shut, as if holding herself together. Her breathing stayed long and steady, like someone trying to find her heartbeat in a storm. Harlow leaned down and spoke just loud enough for the phones around to catch it. "See, all you had to do was behave." His crooked smile shifted the crowd from shock to anger. A young man moved to intervene, but was stopped by a nearby officer who signaled with his eyes, "Don't. You'll only make it worse for her." Keller kept filming, the lens shaking slightly, his breath quick, not from fear but from excitement. "There it is," he whispered, a lesson for the self-righteous. Every word made the air thicker. A child walking past with his mother stopped to stare, wide-eyed, confused, why no one was speaking up as a woman was forced to kneel in front of a courthouse. Harlow stood tall, looking down at her with the pride of someone who believed he'd won. "Now, do you see your place?" he asked, voice smug. Amira opened her eyes and raised her head slowly. There was no fear in them, only a quiet look that pierced his pride like a needle. "My place," she said softly, "is somewhere you've never reached." Harlow let out a sharp, dry laugh. "Hear that, Judge Judge Holt?" he mocked, trying to pull laughter from his teammates. "Someone like her. No one's buying that." His words drew low gasps. A woman in the crowd shook her head, clutching her purse, stepping back, face tight with anger and shame. A courthouse staffer rushed out, footsteps quick, voice cracking as he saw what was happening. "God, that's Judge Holt." Harlow spun around, growling, "What did you say?" The young man froze, panic in his eyes, but the words were already loose. Keller looked up, eyes wide, while Harlow gave a dry laugh to mask the tremor rising in his chest. "Judge," he said, "don't tell me she sits on the bench. Jefferson's full of delusional types." The staffer stepped back, ready to explain, but Harlow's glare silenced him. The crowd had started whispering, now voices spreading like wind. "She really is a judge. I saw her name in last week's report." "No way. What are they doing?" The murmurs grew, phones buzzed nonstop, and dozens of live streams were already uploading as the scene kept unfolding. Amira remained kneeling, her hand resting on her knee, steady, unresisting. She looked up at the tall stone columns, light casting across her face, drawing out the calm and sorrow in her eyes. She took a slow breath and spoke, voice low but firm. "You're turning justice into a tool for your own hatred." Harlow stepped back half a pace, his eyes blinking. "Justice," he laughed. "Justice is when someone knows to bow before this badge." He tapped the emblem on his chest fingers, brushing the metal. "And you, Judge Holt, or whoever, you're no better than me when it comes to the law." A heavy silence followed. From behind the glass doors, a few courthouse staff looked out. One reached for a phone, others just froze, unable to believe what they were seeing. Wind passed through, carrying the scent of old paper and rusted iron from the gate. In that stillness, Amira bowed her head and closed her eyes as if sending a prayer into the space where justice had been violated. Then she opened them and said quietly, "You just stripped away the title you're most proud of." Keller lowered his phone hands slightly, shaking the lens, drifting to the ground. Her words hadn't been loud, but to those nearby they felt final, like witnessing something that couldn't be undone. Harlow pressed his lips together, eyes flickering between anger and fear, but still tried to force a smug grin. "I'll remember that line," he said, voice rough, "so next time you speak it you'll know what you signed up for." Then he turned away, signaling Keller to stop filming. The people nearby began to scatter, but none truly left. They watched Amira, still kneeling on the stone steps, silent as a statue, while the sun climbed higher, casting light that merged her shadow with the base of the courthouse pillars. Something had been touched that morning, not fear, but a moral boundary now crossed. And in that silence, Jefferson began to witness a shift no one saw coming. A woman forced to kneel who stood before the very system bowed under false power. The courthouse bell rang without warning, its metallic chime slicing through the stone hallway like it was waking a space frozen by violence and silence. The main doors of Jefferson Courthouse opened and staff in gray uniforms rushed out, holding documents, their eyes widening at the scene outside. They stopped seeing Amira Holt, still kneeling, seeing the officer standing over her, his face red with sweat and confusion. A woman among the staff stammered, "Judge Holt, you're early. We were preparing for the hearing." The words cut through the air like a blade tearing open the false order cloaking everything. People nearby began to realize something was wrong. Phones lifted higher, whispers spreading like waves across the plaza. Amira opened her eyes, took a deep breath, and slowly stood. That simple motion held the whole space in suspense. She brushed dust from her knee, lifted her chin toward the courthouse doors where sunlight hit the bronze plaque engraved with "Justice for All." In that moment, the slogan tasted bitter with irony. Wind moved through her hair, bringing the scent of rust and damp stone mixing with her steady breath. All eyes turned to her, and in the pale light Amira's face showed no emotion, only the calm of someone who had just reached the end of humiliation. Harlow stepped back, the confidence in his eyes already cracked. "Judge, what?" he muttered, then forced a crooked smile. "What's she saying, Keller?" Keller looked at him, throat tight. This was beyond a simple show of power. Harlow tried to find his old voice again to play the role of control. "If you really are someone," he said loudly, "then kneeling just taught you something too. Justice needs humility." He tried to sound firm, but the end of his sentence broke off as if he heard the tremble himself. Amira turned to face him, her eyes deep and quiet, with no hatred, no contempt, only a silence sharp enough to make someone ashamed just for standing in it. "You have 10 minutes, she said calmly, voice steady like the ticking of a clock, to reflect on everything you just did. Harlow blinked, confused. "Warning me," he laughed, trying to recover his swagger, but the sound came out dry, missing its usual weight. "Who do you think you are?" he asked, then lower. "Really, who do you think you are to teach me a lesson?" No one answered. His voice faded into the wind, swallowed by the space around them. A few bystanders began filming closer, and in every frame Harlow looked like a man who had just shot himself in the foot. Amira simply nodded, eyes shifting toward the building behind. One of the courthouse staff stepped closer, voice shaken. "Ma'am, they're waiting in the courtroom. The disciplinary committee is already seated." The words left those nearby in stunned silence. Keller looked at Harlow, his lips dry. "Disciplinary committee?" he asked, voice barely a breath. "You think she's joking?" Keller replied, and for the first time that morning, he didn't dare to smile. Harlow tried to smirk, but it came out twisted like a tear across his face. "She's just lucky," he muttered. "Maybe some senior staff. But a judge." "Don't make me laugh." Amira looked directly at him, the light in her eyes sharp enough to make Harlow turn away. "You've just proven something," she said softly, "that those in power are often the ones who forget what justice truly means." The words weren't loud, but they cut through the tension like cold water. Harlow bit his lip, hand gripping his belt, but no words came. In his mind flashed the image of lenses aimed at him and thousands of unseen eyes watching. A strong gust swept across the steps, lifting dust into the air. Amira walked forward, passing Harlow without looking back. Her steps were slow, steady, headed for the open door. Inside, a few courthouse staff stood at attention. An older man in a black suit bowed slightly and spoke quietly. "The courtroom is ready, Judge Holt." She nodded, placed her hand on the door handle, and paused. 10 minutes, she repeated, voice low enough for someone to see themselves clearly. Harlow stood still, watching her disappear behind the door. It shut with a soft click, but in his head it sounded like thunder. The courtyard was quiet now, broken only by wind scraping through columns and the buzz of phones alerting to a spreading video. A few people remained, their eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and shame. Keller looked at Harlow, exhaled, and said quietly, "I think you really messed up, Brent." Harlow said nothing. Sweat dampened the back of his neck and his palms had gone cold. He tried telling himself it was all a misunderstanding, but deep in his chest something unfamiliar began to rise, fear. Jefferson, a city used to quiet, forgettable mornings, had seen something different. A man who thought he stood above all had just been warned by the very person he believed would bow. And as sunlight touched the courthouse gate, no one knew that in just 10 minutes the balance of power would flip and Jefferson would never be the same. That afternoon, Jefferson was no longer a quiet city. A video under 2 minutes filmed on Dane Keller's phone spread faster than anyone could contain. It showed that a police officer forcing a black woman to kneel outside a federal courthouse, captioned, "Police officer forces woman to kneel at courthouse." Within hours, reposts flooded every social platform. Each angle, each frame stirred the same feeling, humiliation wrapped in the name of authority. Comments poured in non-stop, from those furious over racial injustice to those defending law enforcement saying there's always a reason. Jefferson was now the center of a digital firestorm. 6 hours later, the hashtag #KneelForJustice shot to #1 on the national trending board. Reaction videos, boycott calls, and breaking reports filled local TV. CNN Local aired the footage with a red banner. "Where is justice when power is used to humiliate?" In Jefferson, cafes, offices, and schools were buzzing. Everyone knew Harlow's name, even if most had never met him. People paused work just to re-watch the clip, discussing the woman's expression as she knelt and her final words before entering the courthouse. In the Jefferson Police Department break room, Harlow leaned back in his chair, phone in hand, smirking. On screen, the view count climbed rapidly alongside thousands of comments. "The whole country's talking about me," he said loudly, a trace of pride in his voice. "Fine by me as long as it's not illegal." A few officers laughed. One clapped his shoulder, another nodded in approval. "You're famous now." Brent Keller said, lounging back as he scrolled through replies, though most of these comments aren't exactly praise. "No big deal," Harlow replied, voice dry but still trying to sound composed. "Maybe people need a face to blame. I can take it," he exhaled. Smoke, eyes, drifting to the ceiling, a strange mix of pride and unease rising in his chest. His name was everywhere, his face unavoidable, but what unsettled him most was the final line in the video. Amira Holt's voice, low, sharp, and clear as a blade. "You have 10 minutes to reflect on everything you just did." That line appeared in every edit, clipped and shared millions of times. Viewers argued over its meaning. Some called it a threat, others a prophecy. Evening news panels lit up with headlines. "Who is the woman in Jefferson?" The sentence that made a nation pause. "Justice may kneel, but dignity never bows." The story spread beyond state lines. Reporters swarmed Jefferson cameras set up at the courthouse steps where it all happened. Keller scrolled online, his eyes no longer relaxed like they were that morning. "Doesn't it feel off, Brent? People are talking more about her than about you." Harlow frowned and flicked his cigarette into the tray. "It's the internet they'll forget by tomorrow," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Keller looked him in the eye, speaking low. "No, I think this time's different. They're trying to find out who she is." Outside, night wind swept into the city, damp and cold. On the phone screen, a post had just been shared hundreds of thousands of times in under 10 minutes. The headline read in bold, "The woman who said you have 10 minutes, possibly Judge Amira Holt." Below it, a comparison image, one still from the video, one official portrait from the federal court website. The internet lit up. Comments flooded in. "If that's true, the woman who kneeled this morning is the one who'll judge them tomorrow. Justice just stood up, and this time it's bringing the gavel." At the police department, the mood had clearly shifted. A few officers glanced at Harlow, their looks no longer admiring but uneasy. One lieutenant whispered, "If that really is Judge Holt, Brent, you know what's coming, right?" Harlow shot him a glance, forcing a smile, though his face had gone pale. "Nonsense," he said. "Whoever she is, she won't touch me. I followed protocol." The words came out, but even he didn't believe them all the way. Night fell over Jefferson. The courthouse stayed lit, crowds still gathering, still talking. A group of students taped a sign to the iron fence, "Justice doesn't kneel." Across the city, a live news program discussed the event. The host spoke in a quiet, reflective tone. "What haunts us isn't the officer's actions, but the woman's silence. A silence that's forcing the whole country to look at itself." On Harlow's desk, his phone buzzed again. A message from Keller. "They just confirmed it, Brent. She really is Judge Holt." Harlow read the line and his eyes darkened. The clock on the wall chimed 9 o'clock sharp. 10 hours had passed since she said, "You have 10 minutes." And now the entire city of Jefferson seemed to be counting down with him. Night fell over Jefferson like a heavy blanket on a city at a boil. Streets around the courthouse still bustled with people, news lights still blazing, while inside the police department the air felt thick like cigarette smoke. The second-floor briefing room, usually used for routine reviews, was packed. Officers sat in rows, faces tense. Police Chief Grant Wilmore stood at the head of the table holding a hastily printed report on that morning's incident. Fluorescent lights above cast a harsh glow on Harlow's face, pale and rigid as stone. Wilmore dropped the file on the table, his voice hoarse with restrained anger. "Got anything to say to the whole department, Harlow?" At the far end, Keller sat silent, eyes avoiding contact. Harlow clenched his fists, lifted his head, and forced a steady tone. "I followed the procedure. A civilian breached a secure area. I gave verbal warnings before acting. Witnesses. Video." Wilmore leaned in, bracing on the table. In that video, the whole country's watching it. You have any idea what the fallout from your so-called procedure looks like? The room went still. Even footsteps in the hallway outside grew quiet. Keller swallowed, voice low. "Chief, maybe it was a misunderstanding. Brent was doing his job, but she looked at me like she already knew how it would play out." Heads turned. Wilmore narrowed his eyes. "Who is she?" No one answered right away. Finally, a lieutenant in the corner spoke up, voice flat. "Sir, online sources confirmed. The woman this morning was Judge Amira Holt, newly appointed to the Federal Judicial Ethics Committee. The only sound was a pen dropping to the floor, rolling across tile." Harlow scoffed, still trying to posture. "Judge, she stood there like any regular person. No badge, no detail, no nameplate." Keller looked at him and muttered, "Brent, did you see the way she looked at you like you were just a test?" Harlow's eyes narrowed and his hand slammed the table. "Shut up, Keller. You filmed. I did my job. Neither of us did anything wrong." But his voice had lost all edge. Wilmore stood straight, his stare cold as steel. "Right or wrong isn't up to you anymore. This has reached the U.S. Attorney's Office. Worse, Judge Holt herself requested an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning." The room stirred, chairs scraping. "Tomorrow," someone repeated. Less than 24 hours, Wilmore nodded, placing a red-stamped notice on the table. At the top it read, "Full Jefferson Patrol Division to appear for special session, 9 o'clock a.m." The room froze. Harlow picked up the paper, scanning the lines, his hand slightly shaken. He tried to smile, but it twisted badly, making others avert their eyes. "It's probably just formal," he said. "They wouldn't escalate over a small misunderstanding." Wilmore locked eyes with him. "No, this isn't Jefferson's problem anymore. This is a federally monitored case. You haven't just put yourself in trouble, you've dragged the entire department in with you." Keller sat still, head bowed. He remembered the moment Amira looked into the camera, eyes calm but deep, as a pit making him feel like he was the one being recorded. Thinking back, it chilled him. She knew he whispered almost to himself from the moment she said 10 minutes. She knew it would spread like this. Harlow snapped around, voice sharp. "Shut up, Keller. Don't talk like she's some prophet." But his eyes drifted away because deep down he was wondering the same. Wilmore closed the file, his voice dropping. "I don't care who's right anymore. Tomorrow morning you speak before a federal panel. Until then, you're suspended. Turn in your badge and weapon. I suggest you figure out how to show you're sorry before it's too late." Harlow stood, face flushed, voice caught in his throat. "I did nothing wrong. I represent the law. I was keeping order." Wilmore stared at him, speaking slowly. "Which is why the country's asking if justice comes from someone who abuses power. Is that order worth trusting?" The words silenced Harlow. The hum of the air conditioner filled the room like the breath of a place waiting for someone to wake up. He stepped back, eyes conflicted, then turned and left. The door closed behind him, leaving a cold void. A young officer spoke, voice shaky. "Chief, if she really is Judge Holt, does he have any chance?" Wilmore looked out the window at the courthouse lights spilling across the city. "No one has a chance once the truth starts speaking." In the corner, Keller sat with his phone. The original clip was still up with millions of shares and new comments flooding in every second. One comment stood out, making his throat tighten. "Justice knelt this morning, but tomorrow it stands at the bench." He looked up, eyes distant. "She said 10 minutes," he murmured again. Maybe she wasn't talking to him. Maybe she was talking to all of Jefferson. Outside, rain began to fall. On the courthouse roof, light bounced off the drops, forming streaks that blinked like a warning. Somewhere in the middle of a public storm, a woman was preparing to walk into a hearing that would forever change the image of justice in this city. And Harlow, alone in his small apartment on the outskirts, stood before a mirror, staring at the face of a man about to face the weight of what he once called law enforcement. In his mind, Amira Holt's calm voice echoed, "You have 10 minutes to reflect on everything you just did." Now, he understood those 10 minutes were never for redemption. They were the countdown to judgment. The next morning, early sunlight cut across the glass panels of Jefferson Courthouse, casting reflections on the wall etched with the words, "In law we trust." The courtroom was packed, the air tight and strange, as if the entire city held its breath for a single moment. Every seat was filled, reporters, lawyers, officers, witnesses. In the front row, Harlow sat upright, hands clenched, pale. Keller sat beside him, sleepless eyes fixed on the floor. The room buzzed with whispers, a low tide of tension. At exactly 9 o'clock, the clerk tapped the gavel, and the doors behind them opened. Harlow swallowed, forcing his head up. The courtroom blazed under white lights shining on the benches where those summoned sat waiting. "All rise," the clerk called out loud and steady. Chairs slid back, fabric rustled, shoes struck wood in a synchronized wave like a ritual marking the start of judgment. Harlow stood bowing by reflex, not daring to look toward the door. In his head, Wilmore's words echoed from the night before, "Don't see enemies, see justice staring back at you," but he couldn't. Each second made a sweat bead on his forehead and confusion tightened in his chest. The door opened. The clerk stepped aside. Light from the hallway spilled in, framing the silhouette of the figure approaching. Low heels struck the floor with a steady rhythm, footsteps like the tick of fate. All eyes turned. And then, from the glow, Amira Holt stepped through to black robe. Flowing hair, tied back, face, calm eyes, steady and cold. Every sound in the room vanished, replaced only by the pounding of hearts. Harlow froze. His throat went dry. Eyes locked on the woman walking toward the bench. "No way," he whispered, barely audible. Keller leaned in, lips parted. "It's her. It's really her." Both men sat motionless, watching the woman they once forced to kneel now ascend the bench framed by the very symbol of justice carved behind her. Each step tapped against the wood, each sound a replay of yesterday's reckoning. Amira placed her file on the bench, nodded to the clerk, then looked out over the courtroom. "You may be seated," she said, voice calm, clear, and low. But no one moved. From spectators to uniformed officers, all remained standing, frozen, unable to believe that the presiding judge today was the same woman humiliated at the courthouse steps just one day before. She scanned the room, eyes passing across every face, stopping at Harlow. He lowered his head, trying to avoid her gaze, but those eyes still found him. It felt like someone was peeling back layers of memory, forcing him to face what he'd done. Keller shifted slightly. His chair let out a faint creak, snapping Harlow's nerve. She tapped the gavel lightly, the sound crisp and firm. "I hope this is a hearing people remember not because of my name, but because of what justice demands." She raised her chin light from the windows, catching her eyes, sharp, calm, almost unreal. A chill ran through the row of officers. The chief, seated up front, tilted his head down and sighed. He knew Harlow had buried himself in his own pride. Amira turned the pages of the file, her voice steady, not loud, but weighty enough to quiet the entire room. "Before me is a report on an incident that occurred right here at the gates of this courthouse, which should stand for order and ethics. That act went national and raised a question about the nature of power." She paused, eyes fixed on Harlow. "Do you have anything to say?" "Officer Harlow." He looked up, lips dry, trying to speak, but no sound came. The room waited. She nodded, slightly, gaze locked. "I told you 10 minutes, and now they're here." The words dropped into the silence like a sentence that needed no gavel. Harlow felt his legs heavy, his mind drifting back to the morning before when he stood proud at the gate, commanding her to kneel. And, oh, the one bowing was him. Keller glanced over, barely holding back a tremble. "Brent," he whispered, "don't say anything." But Harlow didn't hear. Everything spun around him. The phrase 10 minutes echoed endlessly in his head. From her seat, Amira looked down, not with vengeance, but with the quiet depth of someone who knew justice needs no revenge. It balances itself. She leaned down, wrote a few lines into the record, then looked up and spoke clearly. "This hearing is now in session." The room inhaled as one, then everyone everyone sat except Harlow, frozen, unsure what to do. She looked at him, tilted her head slightly, her voice slow and even. "Take a seat, officer. Here, everyone is equal before the law." The words rang quiet but strong, and as Harlow lowered himself into the chair, Jefferson exhaled after a long night. In that moment, justice stood not by force, just by being present. The courtroom was silent. Light from the high windows cut through floating dust, making time feel slower. On the bench, Amira Holt leaned forward, her voice low but clear. "Would you like to recount your actions this morning?" The question wasn't accusatory, but it made Harlow shiver. He took a deep breath, throat tight, eyes searching the room for an exit. I didn't know you were..." He stammered, the sentence breaking because each time her gaze met his excuses vanished. She nodded slightly, her tone steady, neither harsh nor soft. "So, if I were no one that would justify your actions." A quiet sound came from the back row. Then silence. The question was so simple it couldn't be dodged, and that simplicity made it cut deeper. Harlow bowed his head, fists clenched, sweat dripping onto the table. In his mind, the image of the woman kneeling returned no longer a moment of triumph, but a lasting stain. "I followed procedure," he whispered. "I thought she was in a restricted area." Amira opened the file in front of her, eyes still locked on him. "What procedure allows you to humiliate someone to prove your power?" He froze, unable to answer. I didn't know you were a judge," he repeated, voice fading. She nodded gently, a faint smile, as if she'd known that all along. "I'm not asking because I'm a judge, Officer Harlow. I'm asking because there are thousands out there with no title and they still deserve respect. What would you have done if this morning it was someone else with no name, no authority?" Below, Keller looked up, his face pale. His eyes showed the shame of remembering he had filmed it all. Amira paused, letting the silence speak. The wall clock ticked steadily, counting seconds, sading for the truth. Harlow swallowed, hard voice rough. "I was wrong to let emotion guide my actions," she replied gently. "No, you were wrong to let power erase your humanity." The words dropped heavily. No one moved. Amira looked around, her gaze softer but firm. "I don't need justification. I need you to understand why you did it. If a badge comes at the cost of compassion, what's it worth?" Harlow nodded, lips trembling, eyes blurred with shame. She closed the file, her voice lower but clear. "Justice doesn't need shouting. It only needs those brave enough to look inward." In that moment, everyone felt the weight of calm. No anger, no defense, just silence and awareness, what Jefferson needed more than any verdict. Harlow sat low, head down, and Amira watched him. Her eyes didn't show victory, only a reminder that all power begins with knowing when to bow. Amira Holt looked straight at Brent Harlow, her eyes lit under the white lights not with resentment, but with the sharp clarity of reason. She cut him off mid-sentence, her voice steady, not loud, but clear to everyone in the room. "So if I were no one, you had the right to humiliate me." The question landed gently but heavier than any formal charge. It wasn't aimed just at Harlow. It swept across the room, touching every gaze, now frozen in silence. A moment stretched out soundless, except for heavy breathing and the slow tick of the wall clock. Harlow looked down, throat tight, feeling the weight of the air itself. Sweat broke across his brow as the words repeated in his head, each one crashing like shards of a mirror showing truth. No one in the gallery spoke. A female reporter set her pen down, forgetting to write, eyes fixed on the judge facing the officer. The question needed no answer because everyone knew if the answer was yes, they too were being judged. Keller, from the row behind, stared at his hands, guilt twisting in his chest. The room felt lit, not by the bulbs, but by something deeper, the light of truth. Harlow took a slow breath, his voice barely holding. I abused my authority." Amira didn't respond. She nodded slightly, not because she expected him to admit it, but because he needed to. A few people in the gallery lowered their heads, some clenched their fists, and others exhaled. The courtroom sank into into a different silence, the kind that follows awakening. From the lawyer's bench, someone whispered, "That's the question everyone in this field fears most." Amira turned forward, her voice deepening. "Justice has no face, but today you've shown the world one it should never wear. And if I weren't in this position, would anyone still believe in what's right?" Harlow didn't respond, his eyes wet face hollowed in seconds. The question sliced through the courtroom's long-standing habits, where judgment was more common than understanding. No one dared look up at the bench. Even those confident they knew where law ended and power began felt exposed to a mirror they couldn't avoid. As the clerk's pen began to scratch down the transcript, Amira looked toward the officers, her voice soft but firm. "Today, I'm not the one questioning him. Justice is questioning all of us." And in that moment, the entire courtroom bowed their heads not by command but by instinct, having just witnessed the power of a sentence that made an entire system look inward. The next noon, Jefferson was flooded with breaking news. On nearly every major network, the hearing video played on repeat. The camera zoomed in on Harlow's bowed head, sweat shining under courtroom lights, while beside him, Judge Amira Holt sat upright, her calm eyes, steady voice low and clear through the microphone. One anchor summed up the moment in a single line: "Instant karma in court." The phrase spread fast, becoming a viral slogan tied to the image of the officer who once smirked, now humbled before justice. Online platforms exploded headlines firing nonstop, from courthouse steps to judge's bench. Jefferson's fastest reversal. Cop who forced kneeling now, judged by same woman. Karma doesn't wait. Every hour brought hundreds of thousands more shares from everyday citizens to civil rights leaders. They all focused on one thing: Judge Holt's silence held more power than any accusation. A national paper ran her photo on the front page, robed in black eyes, forward with the headline, "Justice Stands." Harlow sat alone in a temporary apartment, the TV on but distant. On screen, he saw himself, a man, bowed shoulders, trembling in a room of light, while viewers outside clapped. Every excuse he had was now meaningless. Keller knocked, holding a newspaper. "See this?" he said quietly. "They're calling it Jefferson's wake-up moment." Harlow said nothing, eyes locked on the screen where Judge Holt spoke. "Justice is not a privilege for the powerful, but a reminder to those who wield power." That line was replayed dozens of times that day, quickly becoming the week's most shared quote. In Washington, a Justice Department spokesperson told the press the case would be reviewed as a professional ethics case study in law enforcement. Online reaction videos, ethics talks, memes, and even short songs emerged from Holt's words. But what truly made people pause wasn't revenge. It was witnessing something rare, a confrontation between power and dignity at a place where both are often blurred. That evening, the national news opened with Jefferson Courthouse lit bright lines of people laying flowers at the gate. A reporter, voice low, said, "They're not just honoring Judge Holt. They're honoring what society once forgot, that justice doesn't need noise, it just needs to be seen." Among the crowd stood police officers, some quietly removing their hats toward the gate. The hashtag Hatch Stand for Justice replaced Hatch Kneel for justice overnight, as the public confirmed justice had risen. In the courthouse's small press room, Amira declined interviews. When a reporter asked, "How do you feel about the case becoming a national moment?" she replied slowly, "I only did what needed to be done. If truth makes someone lower their head, that's justice doing its job, not me." Her answer aired on CNN, drawing millions of comments. She was called Judge of the Century, but those who knew her understood what set her apart. She didn't seek victory, only a way for others to learn from their own failure. As night fell, light from tall buildings reflected onto the courthouse gate, casting a glow on the words, "Justice for All." In that stillness, Jefferson felt cleansed of its arrogance. Justice had gone national not as a scandal, but as a reminder that in an age ruled by media, truth could still make a country bow not out of fear, but respect. Amira Holt reviewed the final lines of the report, her eyes pausing on each signature from the Jefferson patrol team. The courtroom was silent, broken only by pen strokes and Harlow's heavy breaths. She looked up, voice steady and clear as still water before a storm. After reviewing the evidence, testimony, and public impact, this court rules for the temporary suspension of Officer Brent Harlow and all involved patrol officers pending further investigation. The words dropped like a stone into water, rippling silently but irreversibly. Some reporters looked up, fingers typing fast. Harlow clenched his fist, knuckles wide. He wanted to speak to object, but when her eyes met his, every word caught in his throat. She closed the file, set down her pen, and leaned slightly forward. "This is not punishment," she said. "It's a chance to reflect on how you carry justice." The room settled into a quiet wait, and for a moment, everyone felt the difference between a sentence and a lesson. Keller sat in the back row, eyes misting. He wasn't thinking about consequences, only her voice echoing in his mind, steady and firm. The room was full of light, but no one felt relief because everyone knew justice had just been restored in a way few had expected, through calm. That afternoon, major networks aired the ruling repeatedly. CNN's ticker read, "Jefferson Court suspends officers after viral incident." Online, thousands of comments poured in, many in support. One read, "Justice doesn't need revenge, just needs to be enforced." Others praised Judge Holt's approach, firm but not cruel, decisive without demeaning. Civil rights groups issued statements of support, calling it a landmark in rebuilding public trust in the legal system. In Jefferson, crowds gathered at the courthouse, raising signs, some bringing flowers, others silently placing notes that read, "Thank you for standing tall." That night, the streets of the small city lit up with phone screens as residents shared images of the flag waving outside the courthouse. The hashtag, #stand for justice, first came from a local citizen, but within hours it had spread across the nation. Each post carried the same message. She was forced to kneel, but society stood up. The change in a simple hashtag held deep meaning. It wasn't about one person, but a community reclaiming dignity, lost in a storm of discrimination. In her office, Amira sat alone, the window cracked open, night wind carrying the scent of rain and distant traffic. On the desk lay printed headlines, praise, gratitude, apologies. She skimmed through, then set them down, her eyes calm. "Stand for justice," she repeated silently, not as a slogan, but a reminder. Outside, the city remained noisy, but inside that room, Jefferson had never been quieter because justice had just been lifted, not by the force of a gavel, but by the choice to stand tall against what once made people bow. After the hearing, the atmosphere inside the Jefferson Courthouse shifted noticeably. People believed the matter was over, that it would end with a suspension. But to Judge Amira Holt, what had happened was only the surface. She didn't see Harlow's actions as an isolated incident, but as a symptom of a deeper systemic flaw. The next morning, she signed a formal request to the Internal Review Committee, ordering a full audit of every case Officer Brent Harlow had handled over the past 2 years. Justice doesn't just punish the present, it must understand the past, she told her clerk, her gaze calm but firm. The case files began arriving that same day, thick folders, numbered and labeled. She sat for hours in the small office, flipping through every page, reading every report, every statement, every transcript. The silence in the room grew heavier the deeper she read. Among more than 30 cases involving Harlow, 3 stood out with chilling consistency. Each involved public mistreatment of people of color. The same language, the same behavior, the same justification, suspected disorderly conduct. Each case was a fragment of a larger truth the system had ignored. When the summary report landed on her desk, Amira read it over and over, lips pressed tight. One case took place at Franklin Park, where a middle-aged man was forced to the ground for arguing against an unreasonable order. Another, outside a supermarket, where a young woman's bag was searched for noncompliance. The third, most painful, showed a father dragged from his car in front of his children for driving in a restricted zone. Each line was proof of abuse, but what struck her most was not Harlow's actions. It was that every report had been stamped, procedure followed. By late afternoon, she summoned Keller to her office. He walked in, face drained, unable to meet her eyes. She didn't accuse him, only slid the file toward him. "You were present in these?" Keller nodded, his hands trembling. "I filmed the videos, but never submitted the originals," he said, voice hoarse. "Why?" she asked. "Because if I did, they'd ask me to edit them. They told me to clean the reports, avoid trouble for the department." The room felt heavier with his words. Amira leaned back, exhaled slowly. "Trouble for the department or trouble for your conscience?" she asked. Keller lowered his head, silent. When the meeting ended, she looked out the window. The Jefferson sky had dimmed again, just like the early days of the incident. A soft rain swept across the streets, washing the dust of summer, but also bringing back the weight of what lay beneath its surface. At the committee's offices, people began whispering about the Holt effect. A growing movement courts across the state were beginning to re-examine how police conduct was evaluated in racially charged incidents. That night, Amira remained in her office, the soft glow of her desk lamp casting warm light over the still-open case files. She knew the real journey was only beginning. Discovering those 3 cases wasn't just evidence against Harlow, but a mirror held up to a system long accustomed to overlooking wrongdoing for the sake of convenience. She scribbled one last line in her notebook: justice was not born to punish, but to teach people how to respect again. Jefferson was quiet, yet within that stillness the city seemed to be waking up once more. When the internal report on Harlow's past cases was released, the backlash spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours, the media picked up the story, and evening news broadcasts led with headlines like "Jefferson Files Exposed." Online, the conversation moved beyond the viral courthouse video to deeper probes into Harlow's record and his patrol team. Old footage, buried testimonies, and previously silent victims now came forward together. In the swirl of public outcry, Keller received a summons. He walked into the investigation office with his head down, slow steps weighed by years of silent complicity. The interview room was stark white and cold. A young investigator sat across from Keller, calm but firm. "You know, withholding original footage is obstruction of justice, right?" Keller didn't look up, his fingers, interlaced thumb, circling the old silver ring on his hand. "I know," he answered softly, "but back then everyone did it. Harlow said if we turned it in, we'd be seen as traitors." The investigator jotted notes quickly, then paused to ask, "Do you regret it?" Keller looked up for the first time, eyes sunken. "I don't regret staying silent. I regret thinking silence was normal." While Keller sat under questioning, public fury swelled outside. Civil rights groups held press conferences calling for the dismissal of the entire Jefferson Patrol Unit, framing it as a chance to cleanse the system. Outside the police department, hundreds gathered with signs reading "No Justice, No Badge," and "Clean the System." Old clips from Harlow's cases aired again, fueling outrage. Even those who once defended him fell quiet. Several former colleagues were placed on administrative leave, pending investigation. Under the weight of protest signs, people didn't yell or riot. They stood in silence, a silence louder than any condemnation. That evening, the national news aired live from Jefferson. A reporter stood before the courthouse, backed by the flashes of dozens of cameras. Unprecedented, the anchor said what began as a single incident has sparked a statewide investigation. Public calls now demand the full disbanding of the patrol unit involved in an effort to restore restore trust in justice. On social media, activists launched a new hashtag #CleanJefferson, urging citizens to share experiences of unfair treatment by police. Within hours, thousands of stories appeared, each one a testimony, each testimony a cut into the long-standing wall of silence. Inside her office, Judge Amira Holt watched it all unfold. She silently observed the screen where Keller's face appeared in a short segment, his eyes like someone confessing to the world. She understood justice didn't always need a command, it moved under the weight of truth. She closed her laptop and scribbled a brief note into her journal. When people dare to admit wrong, society has already come halfway to justice. Outside, the rain fell again, blurring with the city lights into glowing streaks across the glass. Jefferson seemed to be cleansing itself, not just of one man's failure, but of a system's habit of looking away. The interrogation room was covered in cold white light, reflecting off the walls, making the air feel even heavier. Brent Harlow sat at the end of the table, both hands in front of him, calloused fingers stiff in a defensive posture. Across from him sat Judge Amira Holt, no longer in her black robe, but in a plain suit, her gaze calm as still water. Between them was a space where every word would decide what remained of his dignity. Harlow took a deep breath, the sigh cracking as it left his lips. "I only did what I was taught," he said hoarsely. "Crush before they can react." Amira didn't answer right away. She looked at him for a long moment, eyes not angry, not pitying, but searching, as if trying to understand the machine that had made the man in front of her. "Crush," she repeated slowly. "So you believe power exists to prove who's weaker?" Harlow looked up, met her eyes, then looked down again, his voice drifting like a lost wind. "We were taught to act first, because if you're slow, you get hurt. At the academy, every lesson started with the fear that the other side is always a threat." She nodded slightly, wrote a few lines on the paper in front of her, then said, each word clear, "And that is why justice must be retrained." The words stilled him. He looked at his hands, once steady on a gun, once certain that issuing a command was enough, now trembling like someone wakened from a long sleep. "I didn't think it would go this far," he said. "Just a bad morning, an old reflex. But when you said 10 minutes, I knew something was about to change." Amira looked at him, her voice lower. "It wasn't me. It's this society counting down. And for you that 10 minutes still isn't over." Harlow stayed silent. The clock on the wall ticked steadily like a monotone song of time. "Do you know what hurts me most?" she asked, her gaze never leaving his face. "Not what you did, but that you believed it was right. That you thought humiliating others preserved order when it actually destroys it." He forced a twisted smile. "If I didn't do it, I'd be seen as weak. In this job, weakness means you're out." She tilted her head. "So you chose to destroy others just to survive. That's not strength, Brent. That's fear." He flinched at hearing his name spoken. Her voice stayed steady, never rising, but each word struck where he had never dared to look. She capped her pen, closed her notebook, and said softly, "The system wasn't made to excuse mistakes, but to fix them. You can go on as a blind enforcer or become someone who owns his action." Harlow looked up, eyes red. "If I want to fix it, will anyone believe me?" She gave a faint smile. "Justice begins the moment someone believes they can be different." Outside, the rain fell steadily, the sound of water tapping the glass like the heartbeat of a city learning how to breathe again. Amira gathered her files, stood up, and before stepping out the door, she paused, turned back to him one last time. "You were taught to use power to make others kneel. Now learn how to stand without needing anyone to bow." Harlow watched her silent. The door closed, leaving him in the white room where every echo carried that sentence. A reminder that justice is not just law, but how people are taught to see each other in the light. The phrase, "and that is why justice must be retrained," from Judge Amira Holt, quickly spread beyond the interrogation room, past the Jefferson Courthouse walls, becoming the nation's focal point. The next morning, the Washington Herald ran an editorial titled "Relearn Justice" with a photo of Amira sitting across from Harlow, her eyes calm yet resolute. The article opened, "When a judge says justice must be relearned, it means the system has gone too far in forgetting what it truly means." Within hours, the quote appeared in every major paper, was discussed on news programs, debated in law schools, and cited as the theme in public forums across cities. In Jefferson, passers-by saw the words displayed in bold on the City Hall LED screen, "Justice must be relearned. Amira Holt." This spread was more than a passing media wave. It became a call for change. At police academies, instructors began opening sessions with the quote, asking cadets to debate the true purpose of law enforcement. On national television, experts fiercely debated the idea of a new model of police training. One side called for full restructuring from philosophy to field response. The other warned that rapid reform could shake public confidence in law enforcement. Still, all agreed on one thing: Amira's words struck at the core weakness. People had learned how to hold power, but forgotten how to understand others. In Jefferson, the courthouse became the origin of reform. Veteran officers were summoned to attend short courses on ethics and civil rights. Seminars were held repeatedly themed "Law Enforcement Without Damaging Dignity." Some younger officers attended with skepticism but left deep in thought. One of them said on local news, "I realized that protecting the law doesn't mean defeating people, it means keeping them within fairness." That line was shared millions of times, a rare positive ripple in a society worn thin by division. Amira did not join interviews or public discussions, but she kept watching from afar. Each day, her desk received dozens of thank you letters from police cadets, law students, and ordinary citizens. One letter from a mother read, "My son just got into the police academy. He told me he wants to become someone Judge Holt could be proud of. Thank you for making him believe ethics still belong in this job." She read the letter, smiled, then carefully folded it and placed it in the drawer where she kept reminders of why her work mattered. Meanwhile, in neighboring states, the Department of Justice began reviewing a new training model where emotional control and respect for citizens stood equal to the use of force. Federal workshops titled "Relearn Justice" were held regularly, and Amira was invited as an expert advisor. When she stepped up to speak at the first session, she said simply, "Justice doesn't need to be rewritten. It needs to be relearned by the heart." Thousands in the auditorium stood and applauded, not because she was a judge, but because they felt the strength of something simple and true. Since then, Jefferson became more than a city name. It became a symbol of awakening. Amira Holt's words entered textbooks, taught as lessons for future generations. Law is the foundation, but the human heart is justice's true home. And in that place, among cold stone buildings, people had learned to be human again before learning to judge others. On a Monday morning, just when things seemed to be settling down, the Jefferson Courthouse received an anonymous package. Inside was a hard drive containing a video shot from the opposite angle of the incident at the courthouse steps. The tech team verified its authenticity and immediately forwarded it to Judge Amira Holt. She opened the file in her office, the dim light from the screen reflecting on her calm face. Each frame appeared clearly no longer blocked by the crowd like previous versions. The person filming stood across the street, capturing the full scene: Harlow approaching, placing a firm hand on her shoulder, smirking just before forcing her to her knees. It was a moment no one had seen, and that detail changed everything. The footage continued exposing every expression, every smug glance from bystanders. When Harlow said, "Show me how obedient you are," his voice rang out clearly, followed by chuckles from his fellow officers. Amira sat silently, eyes fixed on the screen, her hand clenched tightly, not from anger, but because she now understood this wasn't an isolated act. It was the outcome of a warped power culture. She turned off the video and the room fell silent. Minutes later, the official copy was sent to the Federal Investigation Committee. That same afternoon, the video leaked online. No one knew who released it, but within 2 hours it had millions of views across every platform. This time, there was no debate. Seeing Harlow smirking as he forced a woman to kneel outside a courthouse stunned viewers into outrage. In the comments, thousands wrote, "This isn't justice, it's humiliation in the name of law." Major media outlets aired special reports calling it the footage redefining the Jefferson case. Groups that had stayed silent now spoke out. Emergency press conferences were held demanding a full review of the city's police procedures. At the Jefferson Police Department, the mood collapsed. Officers moved in silence, faces tense. Harlow was called in for additional questioning. When the video played in the conference room, he sat, frozen eyes vacant. No one spoke to him, but every look from his colleagues made it clear there was no room left for excuses. Keller stood in the corner, hat in hand, visibly shaken. "You laugh," he said quietly. "You laugh," when she looked up. Harlow lowered his head, lips trembling, but no words came out. At the same time, outside Jefferson, protests spread across the state. Hundreds gathered in front of the courthouse holding signs that read, "Dignity is not optional, and she stood for us all." Candles lined the courthouse steps, their golden light illuminating the stone wall where abuse had once taken place, now covered in solidarity. When a reporter asked an elderly woman in the crowd why she stood in the rain for hours, she replied softly, "Because I want my daughter to see that justice is being rebuilt." In her office, Amira received a call from the Department of Justice. The voice on the line was low and firm. "The new video will serve as grounds to open a federal hearing. Jefferson is no longer just one city's story." She paused for a moment, then replied, "Good. Sometimes to relearn justice we must begin by confronting our own reflection." Outside the window, the rain fell harder, but the candlelight below still burned bright. Jefferson was no longer just the side of a case, but a mirror, reflecting a nation asking itself, what does justice mean when human dignity is no longer honored? News of the new video spread like a storm, flooding every evening broadcast. National networks replayed the moment Harlow leaned in, that cold smile on his face as he forced a woman to her knees in broad daylight. The sounds from the footage, the officer's boots on stone, faint laughter behind him, her breath catching, were replayed so often everyone knew them by heart. But this time, no one could watch in silence. Reports opened with the same line, "This is not an isolated incident, but a portrait of a justice system worn thin." The entire country seemed to pause, forced to face what had happened in Jefferson, a truth too clear to ignore. In major cities, people took to the streets not in chaos, but in calm marches. They held candles and handwritten signs, "Justice is watching." Lines of flame stretched across courthouse steps nationwide, a silent vow that justice would not be extinguished. Universities hosted forums and students debated the social responsibility of law enforcement. On public radio, callers shared stories of past mistreatment. The nation seemed to breathe in a different rhythm, one where outrage met the desire to repair. Within 2 days, state lawmakers spoke out, many demanding a federal probe into recruitment and training processes within law enforcement. Public pressure mounted to the point that the Justice Department could not remain still on. By Tuesday morning, they released an official statement. A public hearing will be held in Jefferson to review the full scope of the incident, including individual actions and systemic accountability. The brief announcement sent media outlets into a frenzy. Dozens of crews arrived in Jefferson, cameras aimed at the courthouse where it all began. The entire city slipped into a state of anticipation where every citizen understood that this was more than a hearing. It was a chance for America to face itself. In her office, Amira Holt quietly watched the news. She saw crowds holding candles in the rain, saw the words "Relearn Justice" written across signs. As the segment ended, the reporter announced the Department of Justice has formally summoned Judge Holt to serve as an independent legal advisor. She sat still, hands clasped together. There was something both solemn and heavy in that moment when the justice she believed in was being called upon not by reason, but by the pain laid bare. On the day the hearing was announced, Jefferson's Courthouse became the nation's focus. Reporters camped overnight, floodlights lit the streets like the city had forgotten how to sleep. A child walking with her mother asked, "Why do people bring candles to court?" The mother softly replied, "Because light helps people see what's right." In another corner, Keller stood among the crowd staring up at the stone steps where he once filmed the incident. Jefferson, to him, no longer looked the same. The bell tower rang out, echoing across the block, blending with the footsteps of hundreds moving in the same direction. And within that crowd, Amira stepped out from the heavy wooden doors, her black robe catching the wind, ready to face not just Harlow, but an entire system brought into the light. The morning of the disciplinary hearing opened under a tension so thick it felt tangible. The Justice Department's main conference room had been converted into an internal tribunal with legal commissioners seated in a half circle facing the presiding bench. White light reflected off dark wood, casting a tone both solemn and cold. Judge Amira Holt sat at the center, a thick stack of files before her, each page a piece of a truth the country had long avoided. Harlow was lead in his face, tired shoulders slightly slumped. Cameras flashed as he entered, reporters crowding to capture every moment. Once seated, Amira spoke, calm and firm. "The disciplinary hearing for Officer Brent Harlow is now in session." Pens scribbled pages, rustled, cameras clicked, creating a strange hum of anticipation. Harlow looked around, eyes landing on Amira, and said hoarsely, "I didn't know who you were." What sounded like an excuse only deepened the weight in the room. She didn't respond immediately, only tilted her head slightly, eyes fixed on him. "You said you didn't know who I was," she repeated. "But would that have changed what you did?" Harlow faltered, glancing at the commissioners as if hoping for sympathy, but none came. She continued, voice steady, holding the weight of truth. "If I weren't a judge, just an ordinary woman, would you have acted differently? Or would you still give orders, still force someone to kneel to prove your authority?" Harlow looked down, his fists tightening. One commissioner asked, "Do you realize your smile in the video proves you weren't acting out of fear, but satisfaction?" Harlow exhaled hard, his face marked by defeat. "I was following protocol. I thought I was maintaining order," he muttered. Amira cut in, soft but resolute. "Order doesn't come from submission. It comes from respect." The room fell silent. An older commissioner flipped through the files, then spoke slowly. "What we're seeing isn't an isolated act. It's the result of a flawed training culture." He turned to Amira. "Judge Holt, do you have a statement?" She glanced at her notes, then looked up, voice composed. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to ask a question. If a system teaches people that dominance is the only way to maintain control, should we punish the individual or fix the lesson itself?" The room grew still. Even those who had remained neutral lowered their heads in thought. At the back of the room, Keller watched quietly, his gaze fixed on every word. In that moment, he understood why this woman had moved an entire city. Not through power, but by forcing people to reflect. Harlow finally murmured, almost conceding, "I didn't think you were someone that mattered." Amira responded with a faint smile, her voice clear enough for the entire room to hear. "And that's the problem. You only show respect when you know someone holds power." A few reporters quickly took note, and the quote soon appeared in headlines across afternoon papers. She spoke, and the room fell silent. The hearing continued, but no one spoke much after that. Every attempt at justification faded into silence. In the gallery, a young law student quietly wrote in her notebook, "Justice is not where the powerful speak, but where everyone listens." When the gavel finally struck to end the session, there was no applause, no celebration. People simply stood and left the room in a different kind of silence. The silence of those who had just witnessed justice being named in its simplest form by truth. Judge Amira Holt's words cut through the quiet like a blade through the long-standing veil of silence that had cloaked the room. And that's the problem. You only show respect when you know someone holds power. She said nothing more, closed the file, placed her pen down, and looked straight at Harlow, not with judgment, but with the gaze of someone who wanted him to understand that this was not just a verdict on one man, but on an entire culture that had forgotten the worth of human dignity. The room froze. Not a pen moved. One commissioner lifted his head as if realizing they had just witnessed a moment history would not forget. A reporter at the back leaned in, transcribing her words, exactly needing no revision. Each syllable already carried the full weight of justice. Within hours of the session closing, major news outlets reported the moment. CNN ran the headline, "Judge Holt respect should not depend on power." The clip spread across social media, Amira's voice, steady, not raised, not trembling yet, compelling enough to stop people mid-scroll. Thousands shared the video with captions like, "One sentence can change the whole system." Law schools across the country quickly added the quote to lectures, citing it as a textbook example of moral authority power rooted in principle, not position. Outside, Jefferson became a focal point once again, but this time not as a city of disgrace, as the birthplace of awakening. Residents hung banners outside the courthouse reading respect beyond titles. On the morning papers, her image stood full-page Amira, in the hearing room, soft light across her calm face. The article beneath read, "She didn't tear the guilty down. She raised what was right." Public discourse followed debate, turned to consensus that power only matters when it teaches people humility. In police precincts, Amira's quote was printed and posted on walls as a reminder. Many young officers, when asked, admitted they felt ashamed for once, believing that flaunting power proved competence. One told a reporter, "We were taught to give orders, but never taught how to show respect." Elsewhere, Keller, who filmed the original video, visited Amira with a printed photo of her at the hearing. "I thought you should know what you said. Changed this whole city," he said sincerely. Amira took the photo and smiled faintly. "It wasn't me. It was the truth speaking for itself." A few weeks later, The Atlantic published a long editorial on the Jefferson case, calling her, quote, "the turning point of modern justice." The article ended with a single sentence, "A society is truly civilized only when respect does not require a title." On Capitol Hill, a senator quoted Amira word for word during a speech on police reform, and the entire chamber rose in applause. Back in Jefferson, late at night, as the lights dimmed, people still walked past the courthouse and paused at the steps where it all began. They spoke of that quote like a shared vow that respect should never be born of fear, but of awareness. And from that night on, Jefferson was no longer a city stained by injustice, but a place where people learned to see each other not through power, but through dignity. Final Judgment Day in the Jefferson case began under a clear, cold sky, sunlight slanting through the courthouse columns like a reminder of a morning history would remember. The courtroom was packed to press seats extended into the hallway while citizens stood silently outside watching a live broadcast from the square. Judge Amira Holt entered, face, calm steps, steady. On the bench were two thick files, one for Harlow, one for Keller. She opened the first, the rustle of paper firm and clear. She read aloud, after reviewing all evidence, testimonies, and the conclusions of the Federal Investigation Committee, the court hereby strips Officer Brent Harlow of his badge and permanently terminates his service. In that moment, the room fell still. Harlow bowed his head, gripping the silver badge on his chest, its glint reflecting reflecting onto the ceiling like a fading light. Keller was called next. He stood tall, eyes fixed on Amira without flinching. She spoke her tone even without emotion. Dane Keller is suspended for 6 months to undergo retraining in ethics and professional conduct. Keller nodded, expression solemn. He knew this wasn't a punishment but a chance to make things right, and in that brief moment, Amira's gaze said it all. Justice doesn't always punish. Sometimes it teaches those who forgot why they began. Amira closed the file, placed her hand on the desk, her voice steady, every word clear. No one is allowed to turn power into a tool for humiliation. The sentence echoed through the courtroom, carried by speakers into Jefferson Square where people stood silent. No cheers, no applause, just the solemn silence of a crowd witnessing a new boundary drawn between power and dignity. Outside the courthouse, hundreds bowed their heads, some wiped tears. Others smiled faintly as if they had just seen something long overdue justice return to its rightful form. As Amira rose, the midday light streamed through the tall glass behind her, casting a long beam across her desk. She looked toward Harlow, and her tone softened. "You once knelt before justice," as the accused now learned to stand as someone who understands remorse. Harlow said nothing, but his eyes welled up. Perhaps in that moment he truly understood what fairness meant. She turned to Keller, nodded gently, then stepped down. Each of her steps echoed firm and steady like the heartbeat of a city reclaiming its moral order. The verdict aired live headlines appearing across media, from kneeling to judging. Jefferson's turning point. In many places, people hung images of Amira at the courthouse as a symbol of justice with a human face. That night, a reporter asked an elderly man standing outside what he thought of the trial. He answered slowly, "Justice didn't strike harder today. It struck at the right time." And it was true. Jefferson was no longer a place where people were forced to kneel, but a place where they learned to stand for what is right. As Amira left the courthouse, the wind swept across the stone steps, carrying scattered newspapers with the headline, "No one should bow before power," fluttering in the breeze. In that moment, she paused briefly, looking up at the old stone building, then walked on. In the fading light of the afternoon, her figure blended into the Jefferson skyline, leaving behind a legacy that needed no monument, yet lived on in the hearts of those who believed justice begins with mutual respect. Following the verdict, media across the country reported on Jefferson. Major outlets like the New York Times and Washington Herald ran the same headline, "From Kneeling to Judging, Jefferson's Turning Point," a short, powerful phrase that captured a society's journey from fear-driven justice. Images of Judge Amira Holt in court, standing tall, eyes calm, her black robe reflecting light, appeared everywhere, from front pages to city screens. Evening programs devoted their airtime to Jefferson's turning point, where a woman once forced to kneel led an entire system to bow and relearn the meaning of respect. One anchor closed with a line that left viewers silent. "Not every kneel is defeat. Sometimes it's where justice begins." On forums and social media, comments flooded in. One read, "I had lost faith in courts, but today, Jefferson made me believe justice can still stand." Photos of Amira were placed side by side with the moment Harlow forced her to kneel, creating a symbolic contrast. International press covered the story too, calling her the woman who made justice stand tall again. In Jefferson, those who witnessed that morning still recounted it in detail like a memory etched in time. A local vendor told reporters, "I saw her lift her head in the crowd, and now she's made the whole city do the same." That line was chosen to open a documentary being made about the case. As she stepped out, the noon sun cast light across the stone steps, reflecting off Amira's robe like a beam pulling Jefferson up with her. The crowd at the gate fell silent, then gently parted, clear her path. A young girl in the crowd held up a small sign with shaky letters. "We stand because she did." Amira stopped, bent down, touched the sign and smiled. It wasn't the smile of a victor, but of someone who had completed a mission. She walked forward slowly, each step tapping against the stone, each sound marking a new step for justice in Jefferson. The reporters followed, calling her name, asking how she felt after the verdict. Amira turned and answered simply, "Justice has no winners, only those brave enough to keep it upright." The crowd behind her erupted not in cheers, but in a long, deep round of applause, a rare sound full of respect. At the top of the steps, Harlow stood quietly, no longer defiant, but filled with remorse. After the hearing, Keller walked over to him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "Maybe this is the first time we understand what justice really means." As Amira left the courthouse grounds, the early afternoon breeze swept through, carrying paper sounds and the heaviness that had hung over Jefferson for months. Sunlight reflected off the Justice for All badge at the gate, shining cleaner than ever. She paused for a moment, looking toward the statue of Lady Justice, where the sun was casting a beam directly through the scales in her hand. In that light, Amira's face seemed to merge with the symbol she had defended her whole life. Not flawless, not loud, but steady and unshakable. As she walked on, Jefferson stood still, and in that moment people understood the sunlight on her robe wasn't just touching one person, it was shining on justice reborn. 1 month after the historic verdict, Jefferson had changed so much that he was barely recognizable. What was once a city known for its deep divisions and tense silence had become a place where something fragile and new began to grow. Along the main boulevard, tall white banners reading "Respect" in uniform fluttered in the breeze, their clean fabric catching the early autumn sun. Each banner seemed less like a statement and more like a quiet vow repeated block after block. The city had launched the program as a way to rebuild trust between citizens and law enforcement, not through spectacle or slogans alone, but through small, consistent acts of recognition. Hundreds of people gathered for the launch officers and uniform academy cadets, longtime residents, young parents, pushing strollers, even skeptics who had once sworn never to trust a badge again. There were no political speeches, no raised platforms or podiums. Instead, in the heart of the main square stood a single stage, draped in gray cloth, simple and unadorned, with a photograph of Judge Amira Holt from the courtroom proceedings displayed at its center. Above it, bold letters spelled out, "Justice begins with respect." People came not to cheer or protest, but to listen, to sit beside those they once saw as enemies, and hear the stories that had gone untold for too long. Amira was invited to speak, but she gently declined all interviews and public appearances. "I'm just doing my job," she had said quietly when asked, her voice soft and steady like early autumn wind moving through the trees. To her, what had happened in that courtroom wasn't a victory. It wasn't a climax. It was simply a necessary moment, a mirror held up to a society learning painfully to reflect on itself. Yet, despite her avoidance of the spotlight, Amira's image became inescapable. Her name graced magazine covers and TV segments. Her silent poise was shared across social media, captured in black and white stills and video clips, replayed with reverence. In Jefferson, her name was whispered in coffee shops, written in chalk on sidewalks, and mentioned at school assemblies. A local newspaper wrote a simple line beneath a portrait of her: "The woman who refuses to speak of glory because she knows glory isn't what justice needs." The sentence, stark and weighty, resonated with the country. Within days, it was quoted across platforms, reposted tens of thousands of times. Somehow, it encapsulated the spirit not only of Amira, but of a city that had begun to wake up from a long, bitter sleep. Even the atmosphere of Jefferson seemed altered, almost as if the very air had shifted. On street corners, where tension once lingered like smog, there were now soft greetings and careful nods. Officers paused to say hello to shopkeepers, and children were invited on guided tours through police stations during open house days, something unthinkable only months prior. Young recruits now attended a newly established course titled Human Dignity, training created in response to the Jefferson case. It wasn't mandatory for all departments yet, but Jefferson had volunteered to lead by example. Some residents understandably remained skeptical. They had seen too much, lived through too many broken promises to fully trust change. But many agreed something was different. An elderly man who had witnessed the incident that triggered the case spoke to a local reporter while sipping tea on his front porch. "We used to think change was impossible," he said. "Now I see it every day in how people say good morning to each other." His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't apologize for the emotion. There was no shame in feeling the weight of peace, especially when it had taken so long to arrive. Inside the federal courthouse, where high ceilings echoed footsteps and whispers alike, Amira's office remained a quiet sanctuary. Her desk was no longer just a place for case files and rulings. It had become something of a shrine to the city's slow rebirth. Letters arrived daily, handwritten notes, typed messages, even carefully folded children's drawings. Some came from mayors in other cities thanking her for igniting a national conversation about dignity and law enforcement. Others were from young cadets and future officers who saw in her a model of calm kind and unwavering authority. She read every letter. None were skimmed or rushed. After finishing each, she placed them inside a small wooden box on her shelf, not for display, but for remembrance. Amira didn't collect them for pride. Gratitude to her meant less than what the letters represented: a willingness from those once complacent or complicit to begin again. She believed justice was only as strong as a society's willingness to be better. Law could draw lines, but only people could choose to cross them for good. That evening, as the final gathering of the Respect in Uniform program came to a quiet end, Jefferson's sky turned a soft golden hue. The sun cast long shadows on the brick paths, while the wind rustled the last of the summer's leaves from the trees. Most attendees had gone home, leaving behind hand-painted signs resting against lamp posts and benches. Respect is the foundation of law. From the courthouse window, Amira stood and watched. Her hair swayed slightly in the breeze, her face calm. Keller, who had supported her throughout the trial, walked up behind her and said gently, "This city is changing." Amira replied slowly without turning her head, "Because people finally understand that justice isn't made in courtrooms. It grows out there between us." Her words hung in the air like a prayer spoken aloud, not to invoke change, but to acknowledge that it was already happening. Along the road that led away from the square, newly installed streetlights blinked to life. A metal sign stood freshly planted in the grass. It read, "Welcome to Jefferson, where respect rebuilt justice." Drivers slowed as they passed it, some rolling down their windows to take a photo. Others simply nodded. The phrase made people smile, not because it was catchy, but because it felt true. Jefferson had not only been rebuilt by the law, it had been rebuilt by trust. And in the moment, sunlight caught the edge of Amira's robe inside her office. It felt as if the storm had truly passed. Not forgotten, never erased, but behind them. And what remained was something steadier, quieter, a city that had learned to stand tall in silence. One quiet afternoon in mid-autumn, after a short procedural hearing, Amira returned to her office. The room was dim, the light from her window cast in soft lines across her desk. Amid stacks of files and folders sat a single brown envelope, worn at the edges with the police department's postmark. In the corner, written in a slanted script, "To Judge Holt." She paused, her fingers hovering over the envelope, her breath steady. She recognized the handwriting. She sat down slowly, the chair creaking beneath her. After a moment, she opened it. Inside was one folded page. The ink was slightly faded, the handwriting careful, as if the writer's hand shook and he had fought to hold it still. It was from Harlow. His words were few, but each sentence was deliberate. "Dear Judge Holt," he wrote, "I don't know how to begin because any excuse would be meaningless. I used to believe toughness was the only way to earn respect, that fear made people obey. But now I see fear doesn't create order. It only creates silence. And in that silence, I lost my humanity." The letter paused, then continued. "I know one letter can't change the past, but I want to say I'm sorry not for what I've lost, but for what you and this city had to endure." And then, at the very end, a single line stood alone. "Thank you for not breaking me with a sentence, but with the truth." Amira stared at the letter, her eyes lingering on the final words. The room was silent. Even the sound of the city outside seemed to fade. She folded the letter carefully, not out of ritual, but with a kind of quiet respect. She opened her window, letting in the crisp air, and looked out at Jefferson. The sunlight had shifted to that golden hour glow that made even the cracked sidewalks seem softer. Yellow leaves spun in the wind. Her gaze was steady, not cold, not moved to tears, just peaceful, as if she had been waiting for this letter not to absolve anything but to mark a beginning. An apology even late was still the start of change. That night, Amira remained in her office. The only light came from her desk lamp, casting a circle of warmth over the folded letter. She didn't write back, not because she had nothing to say, but because not every answer needs to be spoken. Some truths are answered in silence. She believed Harlow didn't need a reply. What he needed now was his own path forward, and silence, she felt, gave him the space to find it. She placed his letter beside the wooden box filled with thank you notes. She didn't label it. She didn't need to. It was part of the same journey. Outside, the streetlights glowed. A patrol car passed in the distance, but its sound didn't sting the air as it once did. The city felt different now. Less guarded, more alive, as if even its bricks had learned how to breathe again. Amira leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw the courthouse steps again, the sunlight, the murmurs of a crowd, and a man standing alone with his head bowed. It was all behind her now, but not forgotten. A breeze moved through the room. The envelope shifted slightly on the desk, its corner catching the light for just a moment. Amira reached out to steady it, then smiled softly. Justice, she thought, doesn't always need someone to win, just someone brave enough to begin again. She turned off the lamp and stepped into the quiet night. Inside her office, Harlow's letter remained still, but in the silence, Jefferson seemed to exhale as if forgiveness itself had found its way home. That morning, Jefferson welcomed an unusually quiet day. The early sunlight fell across the courthouse, parking lot drops of dew still clinging to the car, roofs sparkling like glass. Amira walked slowly past the rows of vehicles, a folder of morning case files in hand, her mind still occupied with the new trial. She paused when she saw a figure standing at the far end of the lot. It was Harlow. He was no longer in uniform, just a middle-aged man in an old shirt standing upright, cap in hand, stiff posture laced with unease. When their eyes met, neither spoke. A crow called in the distance, slicing through the thick silence that hung over the lot. Harlow stepped closer, stopping a few feet away. His voice was low and rough, carved out of years of regret. "I'm sorry for turning justice into a weapon." Each word dropped heavy, not performative, but like a real confession. Amira looked at him, her eyes neither cold nor soft, but still like morning water. She waited a few seconds before replying quietly, "You didn't turn justice into a weapon. You just forgot it was never yours alone." Her answer made Harlow lower his head, shoulders trembling, not out of fear. In the dim light, she saw that the man who once provoked a city's outrage now stood small face to face with his own consequences. "These past days," he continued, "I walk past that place every morning. The stone steps in front of the courthouse, they're like a scar etched in my mind. I remember that moment and wish I had stayed silent." Amira replied calmly, "Silence doesn't change justice, but listening can." He nodded, his voice catching, "I'm learning how. I've met with people I hurt. I don't ask for forgiveness. I just want them to know I'm not who I was that day." She was still watching him for a long moment. There was something in his tone that made her understand his remorse did not come from fear of punishment, but from sentencing himself. A breeze swept through, scattering a few yellow leaves across the wide courtyard. Morning light slanted down, casting over their faces. Amira spoke softly, like a reminder justice begins when you admit that. Harlow lifted his gaze, eyes wet, but strikingly clear. "Thank you," he said, "for not destroying me, but making me want to change." She nodded slightly, then turned to leave her steps, calm but resolute. As she walked past, Harlow stood still, gripping his cap, head bowed not from shame now, but as a gesture of respect for what was right. From a distance, Keller, the man who filmed the first video, leaned against his car, quietly observing. He watched Harlow stand still for a long time, then slowly walk away, his steps heavy, but his back straight. He turned to see Amira heading toward the courthouse, her dark robe blending with the pale morning light. Jefferson was no longer noisy like in the chaotic days, but calm like after a long rain. In that place, one had learned how to bow for the right reason, and the other continued the path of upholding justice, not through sentencing, but through quiet resolve. And in the space between those two people, the city seemed to exhale softly, as if Jefferson had finally learned how to forgive. Morning light slanted across the row of cars glinting off the dew-covered pavement. Amira stood across from Harlow, the space between them drawn by an invisible line of the past on one side, the woman once humiliated. On the other, the man who had used power to assert himself. When she spoke, her voice wasn't heavy, just calm, as if she had long buried her anger. "Justice begins when you have the courage to admit that." The words came gently, but they struck deep, making the man before her seem to collapse inward. Harlow didn't reply. He only bowed his head, shoulders trembling. His hands clutched his cap, rough palms of a man who once believed power meant control, now shaken like someone learning to hold dignity again. For the first time, he bowed not in defeat, but in understanding. Amira looked at him with no hatred in her eyes. In that moment, the arrogant figure from before became just a man, no uniform, no badge, no armor of authority. All that remained was someone learning to face his own mistakes. "Go, Brent," she said quietly. "Spend what's left of your life doing what's right." He nodded, then stepped back, head still lowered, voice thick. "I will. Even if no one sees it, I have to do what's right." Then Harlow turned and walked away, his steps slow, and waited. His shadow stretched long across the concrete, merging with the spreading light. Amira watched silently. In that moment, she felt more than ever that true remorse was the highest form of justice a person could give himself. Above them, birds settled on the fence, the Jefferson sky clearing after the rain. She stood still, the wind brushing past her robe fabric, swaying gently, as if even time was softening. The days of conflict hearings and rulings all seemed to shrink into this one moment where two people, once on opposite sides of justice, bowed for the same thing, the truth. Amira turned back, walking toward the courthouse where the heavy wooden door stood open and wait. Keller, a few steps away, had watched it all, then lowered his phone. He didn't film, didn't take a photo, because he understood some moments aren't meant to be captured. They're meant to be lived. The morning passed and the city moved on with its day, but the air felt clearer. On the courthouse steps, a janitor wiped away a thin layer of dust, looked up and saw Judge Holt walking by. He smiled and greeted her, and she nodded in return. Everything seemed ordinary, yet beneath that ordinariness was a quiet shift. Jefferson had begun to learn forgiveness, not through words, but through action. Harlow left the lot, walking through the park behind the courthouse. Sunlight fell on his shoulders, each step pressed clearly into the path, not rushed, not hunched as before, but steady like someone who had finally set down a long carried weight. At the edge of the park, the bronze statue of Lady Justice caught the golden light. He stopped, looked up at her, and gave a small nod as if greeting something he once betrayed. In that moment, Jefferson truly stilled, not from guilt, but from awakening. And for Amira, as she stepped back inside the courthouse, she knew justice had completed its journey not with a sentence, but with the first bowed head of a man who had forgotten what it meant to respect. 1 year after the case that shook the nation, Jefferson wore a calmness that felt long lost. In front of the federal courthouse, once the center of a clash between power and dignity, a bronze statue was being erected. Not grand, not towering, but eye-level, just enough for passers-by to stop and look directly into the eyes of the figure it portrayed. It was the image of a black woman standing tall, hands gently clasped before her gaze steady toward the square. Morning sunlight fell on her face, casting a golden hue that made the statue seem alive. Etched into the stone base, one line read, "No one kneels for justice again." On the day of its unveiling, Jefferson was as crowded as during a festival. There were no long speeches, just those who had witnessed everything, now gathering in silence. Amira Holt was invited, but she stood at the edge of the crowd a few steps back. She didn't want to be the center because the statue wasn't for her. It was for all who had once been forced to kneel in the silence of injustice. A soft breeze passed, lifting the state flag into the sky, and the host simply said, "We raise this monument not to honor one person, but to remind ourselves what woke Jefferson up." Applause followed, not loud but deep, the sound of respect more than celebration. Harlow was there too, blending into the crowd, no uniform face, older eyes, quiet. When the veil dropped from the statue, he bowed his head, a simple gesture that carried the weight of his remorse. Keller, who had filmed the first video, was chosen to document the event. As he raised his camera, the lens paused on the bronze face, then slowly panned across the crowd, those who had once accused, once feared, once suffered, now standing together. After the ceremony, people began placing flowers at the statue's base. Some brought white roses, others left handwritten notes, short lines, for every voice that was silenced, for those who stood tall when others bowed. Children came with their parents, looking up to read the words etched in stone, then asking, "Why does it say that a mother leaned down and answered softly, because someone stood up when everyone else bowed?" That answer made nearby strangers smile gently, knowing this wasn't just the story of Amira Holt, but of a city that learned to stand again. Amira left before the ceremony ended. She walked slowly along the courthouse's white pillars, her steps echoing lightly on the stone floor. When she reached the courtyard, she stopped and turned to face the statue. The afternoon light slanted down, reflecting off the bronze so that the eyes of the statue seemed to glow. She looked for a long time, then gave a small nod. No one knew what she was thinking, but perhaps in that moment she was thanking life for taking her through what once felt merciless, so she could understand the human heart more deeply. Evening fell, and Jefferson glowed under the lights. The statue still stood, its shadow stretched long across the courthouse steps. Online, its image spread everywhere, the words on its base shared by millions as a collective vow. In other cities, once marked by injustice, similar statues began to rise, the same line inscribed in many languages, a message that crossed borders and skin color. Residents said that passing by made them feel at peace, as if justice was no longer a distant theory, but something present in daily life. Before leaving Jefferson for Washington, Amira turned back for one last look at the statue. She saw a young girl placing a small bouquet at its base, then looking up into the light. The sight made Amira's heart still, because she knew the justice she had fought for had found its place, not on a courtroom pedestal, but in the hearts of the next generation. She walked on wind, brushing her robe, blending with the distant chime of the town's clock tower. Jefferson at night was quiet, but the bronze glowed like a small flame, reminding everyone that the time had come to live in a world where no one must kneel to be treated fairly. By dusk, Jefferson softened into pale gold. In front of the courthouse, hundreds of candles were lit, their flames reflecting off the bronze statue, making it seem lit from within. People gathered quietly in the square without chants or speeches. Only the wind moved through the trees, and candlelight danced across the faces of those standing there. They hadn't come for a ceremony, but to preserve this moment, the moment when justice, after years of debate, was finally felt as part of life. Amira stood far off, where the candlelight reached her only as a faint glow across the open space. She didn't want to be noticed, because the night wasn't about her. It was about Jefferson. From her spot, she saw each small flame surrounding the statue, forming a circle like a halo around the justice the city had reclaimed. The breeze carried the scent of melting wax and white flowers placed at the statue's base. She stood still for a long time, her hand lightly gripping the edge of her robe. Perhaps she had never felt Jefferson this peaceful, though just a few years ago this very place had been the center of a deep wound. Near the statue, a girl of about 7 looked up, candlelight shining in her clear eyes. She asked her mother, "Is that her?" The mother gently smoothed her hair, her voice soft in the wind. "Doesn't matter as long as you understand why the statue was built." The words were quiet, but enough to make a few around them turn and smile. An older man placed another candle on the ground and said slowly, "Because justice has no fixed face. It can be anyone who stands when others bow." The girl nodded eyes on the bronze figure standing in a sea of light lips, quietly repeating, "No one kneels anymore." Amira heard the conversation from afar, her lips curving into a faint, unreadable smile. She knew she didn't need to be remembered by a name because what mattered more was that the message remained. In the distance, church bells rang, blending with the flickering candlelight, slowing the whole scene down. She quietly turned away, walking along the stone path. Each step seemed to merge with the murmur of wind, of voices of time itself. Behind her, the circle of light kept growing. People continued to arrive, placing more candles. Some brought family photos, others left handwritten notes addressed to the woman of Jefferson. A group of high school students played a short piece on violins, the melody Satan soaring like a farewell to what was and a greeting to what could be. The statue stood still warm, bronze, glowing at the center of a shimmering sea. Amira paused at the end of the street and looked back once more. From where she stood, only flickers of movement remained in the candlelight, but she could still make out the shape of the young girl standing close to her mother, gazing up at the statue with pride in her eyes. Amira nodded slightly, as if sending a silent wish. The night breeze stirred, carrying the scent of melted wax, soft flowers, and the chill of a fading dusk. And there, in a quiet Jefferson justice, was no longer a dry concept in legal texts, but a warmth passed hand to hand, heart to heart, like candlelight that spread without ever going out. Months after the statue was raised, Jefferson was no longer just the story of a small town, but a case study cited in national conferences on legal system reform. At the Federal Police Academy, a new course was added to the curriculum titled Ethics and Human Dignity in Justice Enforcement. The first lesson began with the Jefferson incident, accompanied by the image of the woman standing tall in the square. Young cadets, their blue uniforms still crisp, sat quietly as the old video played. Some bowed their heads, others remained still for a long time. The instructor said justice doesn't begin in the courtroom, but in the moment you know how to stop before a mistake. The official ceremony to introduce the Jefferson case into the academy curriculum was held with solemn respect in the main hall. Amira Holt was invited to speak, and for the first time in months, she agreed to appear in public. When she stepped onto the stage, the hall fell silent, broken only by the soft sound of her shoes on the floor. She brought no script, no prepared speech. She stood still for a moment, looking at the front rows, young faces watching her, then spoke slowly. Justice doesn't need to win, it only needs to stay in shape. The sentence rang out, quiet but firm, pouring into the empty spaces of every mind in the room. After the speech, no one clapped right away. The room stayed silent, as if it needed a moment to absorb what had just been said. Then one pair of hands clapped softly, followed by hundreds more, not loud, but deep and sincere. A cadet stood up and asked Judge Holt, "How do we keep justice in shape when power so easily clouds our vision?" She looked at him, her voice steady by remembering you don't protect laws, you protect people. When you forget that every rule becomes a weapon. The heads in the audience bowed together, and someone wrote down her words in a notebook, a line that would later be engraved outside the Academy library as a reminder to future officers. That afternoon after the ceremony, Amira walked down the Academy hallway lined with framed photographs of historical cases. At the end of the corridor, a new photo had been added showing the "No One Kneels for Justice Again" statue. Below it read Jefferson 2025, where justice was relearned through the human heart. She paused, touching the edge of the frame. A group of students passed by, stopping to greet her, their faces bright, their eyes filled with belief. She smiled in return, then stepped outside into the clear spring sky. On the road away from the academy, Amira felt a quiet unlike any she had known, not the quiet of an ending, but of something passed on. What happened in Jefferson had grown beyond the scope of one case. It had become a lesson, part of a collective memory where people had learned to stop and listen to the rightness within themselves. In other states, law schools and police academies began replicating the model, adding the Jefferson lesson to their curricula. Some instructors said students cried when watching the video, not out of anger, but because they realized the silence of the judge forced to kneel carried more power than 100 justifications. That evening, the Academy's homepage featured a clip of Amira's speech with the caption, "Justice is not the height of power, but the steadiness of the human spirit." The post was shared millions of times, becoming one of the year's most quoted lines. From Washington to Los Angeles, courts, police stations, and universities printed and framed the quote on their wall. In Jefferson, under the glow of the nightlights, the engraved bronze letters beneath the statue shimmered. From a distance, Amira watched a few young cadets pause to take a photo beside the statue, then bow their heads before leaving. In that moment, she knew justice was no longer just defined by statutes. It had become a living legacy, passed on through small actions by those who chose to keep it intact, no matter how time changed. The lights in the hall softened as Judge Amira Holt stepped down from the podium, each footstep deliberate in the heavy silence. In that moment, everyone remained still, echoing her final word. Justice doesn't need to win, it only needs to stay in shape. A hush spread not from hesitation, but because each person was quietly weighing the weight of those words. Then, from the front row, an elderly professor stood and bowed deeply as if acknowledging he had just witnessed something greater than a legal lesson, the humility of conscience. The gesture rippled across the hall, and within seconds, everyone stood and bowed together. Amira paused, raising her head to face the hundreds of silent people before her. She didn't speak, only placed her hand over her chest and gave a slight nod, her gaze warm and steady. In that moment, time felt suspended. There were no camera clicks, no shifting chairs. People bowed not because of her greatness, for the value she represented, a justice that needs no victor, and a truth that doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. The ceiling lights cast down softly, reflecting off their faces, catching the gleam in the eyes of the young cadets, those who had just realized their future job was not just to uphold the law, but to preserve human dignity. The silence lasted nearly a minute, but in that stillness, hundreds of hearts felt connected by a shared belief. Amira's words echoed in their minds, gentle yet resolute, becoming a vow no one needed to say aloud. A young cadet, eyes glistening, clasped his hands behind his back and bowed deeply, as if etching into himself that every decision from now on must be made with compassion. Another, seated at the back, gripped his notebook tightly, where he had written the line, "Justice begins when we dare to face the human being." Amira quietly returned to the podium, her gaze sweeping over the audience, all with heads bowed. She knew there was nothing more she needed to say. No applause, no matter how loud, could carry the same sincerity as this moment of silence. She took a soft breath, her shoulders easing, then spoke in a near whisper, "Thank you for listening with your hearts." A gentle breeze slipped through the window, the white curtain swaying lightly, casting soft light across the room. The sound of breathing blended with her footsteps as she stepped away from the podium, creating a quiet, weighty rhythm, like a farewell from one generation to the next. As she neared the door, the outside light caught her black robe, casting a thin line of reflection. No one spoke, but all eyes followed her. A few placed their hands over their hearts as if to hold on to the moment, and when the door closed behind her, the hall remained still. No one moved. They understood they had just witnessed something rare, a moment where silence had become the language of respect. Outside, the spring breeze passed through the rows of flags. Birds called somewhere above, and within each heart, Amira's words echoed like a quiet vow: justice will be kept in shape by the very hands that know when to bow. Years passed, and Jefferson had changed. The city now wore a calmness that no longer carried the traces of days once shaken. The events of that time slowly became memory, settling into the final pages of legal history. The name Amira Holt was rarely mentioned in everyday conversations, not because people forgot, but because her presence had dissolved into the breath of the city, a natural part of daily life. Children, born afterward, grew up on quiet streets, passing the courthouse each morning, seeing the statue of the stand-in woman without needing the story. To them, it was a symbol that had always been there, like the sky above, or the trees around the square, something that existed without needing explanation. Mornings in Jefferson always began with the steady sound of church bells ringing in the distance, blending with the footsteps of people walking down Federal Avenue. Each time they passed the courthouse, no matter how rushed, they paused for a few seconds before the statue. Some only glanced. Some stood with hands behind their backs. Some quietly laid down a small flower, the words at the base. No one kneels, for justice again had faded slightly over time, but were never replaced. The scratches were kept as proof of the journey. On early morning, sunlight slanted across the bronze figure and lit the faces of those who paused, making the scene feel like an unspoken ritual where justice was remembered not with noise, but with calm. In schools, the Jefferson case was taught as a lesson in professional ethics. Law students memorized Amira's quote, "Justice doesn't need to win, it only needs to keep its shape." They recited it not as words from a hero, but from someone once tested by the very system she defended. At the police academy, new cadets walked past a hallway where a photograph of the courthouse statue hung, all aware they were continuing a promise that respect would never be forgot. As for Amira, after stepping down from office, she chose a quiet life in the southern suburbs of the state. She declined all interview requests and offers to write a memoir, saying her life had already been written about through Jefferson. Occasionally, people spotted her at small forums sitting in the back row listening as young students debated justice. No one recognized her, and she never needed them to. What mattered most to her was that justice had become a habit, not something people had to fight for daily, but something they chose to uphold in small acts and how they treated one another. One early autumn morning, Jefferson glowed under the golden light of the new sun. A young woman walked her child past the courthouse. The boy tugged her hand, looked up at the statue, and asked, "Mom, why does everyone stop there?" She smiled, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "Because here, people learned how to stand tall." The answer was simple, yet it carried what the city had held close for years. As they walked away, the morning sun caught the old bronze lettering, casting a warm glow. The statue stood still, needing no name, no history, because justice was no longer one person's story, but the shared breath of Jefferson, steady, familiar, and as natural as the morning itself. Mornings in Jefferson now began in peaceful stillness. The first rays of light fell across the old stone of the federal courthouse, reflecting off the words engraved deep into the wall. "We rise by respect." The phrase was plain, but powerful enough to make anyone who stopped think of the weight it carried. People said it was chosen directly by the city council after years of discussion about how to honor the event that once shook the state. They didn't want another statue or annual ceremonies, but a message short enough for children to read, yet deep enough to silence grown-ups. Each morning, workers paused to read it again silently, as in Jefferson respect had become instinct, not instruction. Just steps away, the plaza in front of the courthouse had become a gathering spot for students after school. Kids played around the fountain, laughing, stepping on stones engraved with the names of historic cases once tried in the city. They knew nothing of the dust and injustice that once covered this place, but their innocence was the clearest sign that justice had been restored. Adults passing by smiled, some stopping to pick up a fallen leaf near the inscription, brushing it gently as if touching something sacred. Inside the courthouse, the hallway was brighter now thanks to new glass panels. At the center hung a large framed photo of Jefferson from above the statue of the woman still standing tall in the square. Below it, a bronze plaque held Judge Holt's words, "Justice doesn't need to win, it only needs to keep its shape." No one debated its meaning anymore. It had become a way of life. Every new officer had to study Jefferson before starting duty, and they told each other the most important part of the uniform wasn't the badge, but how they saw others. One summer afternoon, a local reporter filmed a 10-year anniversary segment. They interviewed people around the courthouse, asking if anyone still remembered the name Amira Holt. Most just smiled. One replied, "She's right here in every line on the wall in how we treat each other." An old man who had witnessed the event years ago sat on the courthouse steps holding a cup of coffee, his voice low but content. Back then, people bowed out of fear. Now, they bow out of respect. That's enough. As the afternoon settled, the last light of the sun fell on the bronze letters, "We rise by respect," making the wall seem to glow. Laughter, footsteps, and church bells blended into the gentle air of a city that had learned to stand tall with compassion. Jefferson was no longer a place where anyone had to kneel to be seen, because here, people had learned when to bow and when to rise. Every step on the courthouse steps was a quiet affirmation that justice wasn't a destination, but a path walked with respect. And from that place, Jefferson kept growing, not through power, but through dignity. Today, Jefferson carries the calm of a city that has gone through a deep awakening. Under the bright morning sun reflecting off the stone of the federal courthouse, the words, "We rise by respect," shine like a steady reminder of the journey this city has taken. People still tell the story of one morning years ago when a black woman was forced to kneel at the courthouse gate, surrounded by mocking laughter and cameras aimed at her face. It seemed like just another story lost among thousands, but 10 minutes later, it became a symbol of history shifting. Amira Holt, the woman humiliated that morning, entered the very place she had been shamed to sit as its presiding judge. From that day, Jefferson was no longer a city of prejudice, but a proof of conscience awakened. Amira's journey wasn't made of grand gestures, but of quiet resolve. When Harlow threw the paper on the ground, when Keller raised his phone, when the crowd watched with cruel amusement, she didn't respond with anger. She let the truth speak for itself. The moment her knee was forced to the ground, Jefferson reached its limit of cruelty. But from that very limit, a different beginning emerged. She didn't seek revenge, but chose to let the world witness the cost of arrogance. 10 minutes later, when the courtroom doors opened and Harlow saw the woman he had once forced to kneel now sitting at the highest seat in the room, silence fell like a verdict delivered without a gavel. The story spread like fire. The video swept across social media, shared by millions, not for its drama, but because it made people believe that justice still had a place in this world. The phrase, "instant karma in court," became a headline everywhere, but what people remembered most wasn't the image of a cop bowing his head. It was the calm eyes of the woman holding the gavel. She wasn't smug, she wasn't harsh. It was her composure that made justice feel stronger than any sentence ever could. From that first trial, Jefferson began to change. Investigations were launched, hidden wrongs brought to light. Harlow admitted he was only following what the system had taught him, the way power was used to control fear. But Amira forced him and the whole city to relearn the meaning of strength. She said justice doesn't need to win, it just needs to stay in shape. That sentence became a lighthouse for every reform that followed. It taught people that justice wasn't about crushing one side, but about everyone facing the truth and accepting their share of responsibility. Harlow lost his badge, Keller was suspended, but more importantly, the police system began to examine itself. Academies included the story in their curriculum not to dwell on failure, but to teach dignity. Young officers were trained not to command, but to understand the people they protect. Since then, Jefferson no longer had meaningless clashes between power and skin color. People began greeting each other on the street with equal eyes. Respect became a habit, the quiet kind of justice Amira left behind. Her story didn't end with a grand monument. She received no medal, no place in formal ceremonies, but in the center of the city, a statue was raised of a woman standing tall with the words, "No one kneels for justice again," carved at its base. The statue bore no name because Jefferson wanted to remind everyone that justice belongs to no one alone. Each person carries it in their heart. As time passed, Amira left the court and lived quietly outside the city. She refused interviews, wrote no memoir, and took part in other programs. When asked why, she simply said, "My story's already been told in how people live today." In her later years, she would sometimes return to Jefferson, walking along the street leading to the old courthouse. No one recognized the silver-haired woman as the judge from back then. She would stand quietly before the wall engraved with "We rise by respect," resting her hand on the cold stone like touching a memory. Each time, she smiled, not out of pride, but because she knew what she had planted had taken deep root. One evening, as sunset spread across the square, a girl about 8 stopped in front of the statue, tugged her mother's hand, and asked, "Mom, did someone really have to kneel here once?" The mother looked at the statue and replied, "Yes, but because of that, you get to stand tall today." That answer made Amira, standing just a few steps away, pause in silence. She realized what she had done wasn't meant to be remembered, but to make sure children would never have to live through the same. That year, the city council held a 10-year anniversary of the event. There were no flowers, no long speeches, only a moment of silence. When the courthouse bell rang, the people of Jefferson rose together and turned toward the sunlit stone wall. A gentle breeze passed, carrying small flower petals to the foot of the statue. In that moment, no one said a word, but everyone understood that justice was no longer distant. It was alive in every quiet gesture, in each look, and the way they treated one another. The lesson from Amira Holt's story reached far beyond Jefferson's borders. It made people realize that true strength doesn't come from power, but from the ability to restrain it. When power is used to humiliate, humanity is lost. But when it's used to lift others up, justice finds its true meaning. That story wasn't just about fairness, but about dignity. It reminded the world that the self-respect of one person can make an entire system bow its head. Today, when people speak of Jefferson, they don't mention old scandals, but transformation, a city once ruled by fear becoming a symbol of respect. "We rise by respect" is no longer a slogan, but a way of life. New generations growing up in that atmosphere won't know of anyone being forced to kneel, only that in Jefferson people are seen through their dignity, not their color or status. And in a quiet corner of the state, as Amira walks slowly down a sunlit path, she knows she no longer needs to strike a gavel to define justice. Justice has become a habit nurtured by awareness, by the courage to face wrongs, and by mutual respect. She smiles softly as she sees a group of young officers stop before the courthouse, remove their hats, and bow to the statue. The gesture is simple. To Amira, it is the sign of a society that has grown up. Amira Holt's story is no longer about one woman standing against injustice, but about how a city relearned the meaning of respect. It reminds us that justice doesn't need to be celebrated, it needs to be lived every single day. And sometimes a single bow at the right moment is enough to make the world look up.